In this module, we are going to commence by understanding crowding out, factors determining effectiveness of fiscal policy in ISLM model. In the ISLM model, simultaneous equilibrium in goods and asset market is established at common interest rate and income level. IS curve represents the goods market, while the LM curve is the reflection of equilibrium in the assets market. A fiscal policy which is related to government revenue and spending is used to expand and contract the economic activity. Fiscal policy shifts the IS curve, which causes excess demand or excess supply in the money market, which is then corrected by the movement in the interest rate and income level. In the ISLM model, expansionary fiscal policy does not have full multiplier effect on the economy because excess demand for money leads to a rise in interest rate, which in turn causes investment to fall. Overall, this leads to an offsetting fall in investment to an initial increase in the fiscal policy parameter like G. This dampening effect on output is called as the crowding out effect. Due to this crowding out, fiscal policy multiplier in the ISLM model is always lesser than the Keynesian multiplier of aggregate expenditure model, which do not consider investment sensitivity of investment. There are many factors which determine the effectiveness of fiscal policy, like the extent of crowding out, which in turn depends on the slope of IS and LM curve. There are many exceptions also where the crowding out is unlikely, like full employment, accommodating monetary policy, etc. Let us analyze in detail crowding out and determinants of effectiveness of the fiscal policy in the ISLM model. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the meaning of crowding out, understand the effectiveness of fiscal policy in AD/AS framework, identify the factors which determine the effectiveness of fiscal policy, evaluate the extreme cases of full crowding out and no crowding out, analyze the situation where crowding out is unlikely. Let us begin by understanding the meaning of crowding out. When the government uses expansionary fiscal policy with the objective to raise the level of income and output in the economy, it causes an excess demand for money in the money market, which raises interest rate and reduces the private investment spending. The increase in G in the aggregate spending function and the consequent fall in the interest sensitive investment causes the equilibrium income to rise, but not by the full multiplier effect. This dampening of income is referred to as crowding out. In other words, the rising interest rate that follows the increase in government spending crowd out the interest sensitive investment in the aggregate expenditure and results in lower increase in the income level. The crowding out mechanism makes the fiscal policy quite ineffective in achieving its objective of expanding the level of income and output in the economy. Sometimes government raises spending and finances its deficit by borrowing in the domestic market and competing with the domestic private investors, thereby leading to a rise in interest rate. In the former case, when the private sector lends money to the government, they have less money to invest in the private sector projects, thereby leading to crowding out of the private investment. In the latter scenario, in order to borrow from private sector, the government may increase interest rate on its bonds to attract people to buy. These higher interest rates on bonds are likely to discourage private sector investment and spending. In this case, crowding out effect is said to be associated with the use of deficit creating fiscal policies. It should be noted that crowding out is not confined exclusively to the fiscal policy changes. Any of the autonomous spending components which can shift the IS curve and increase the national income trigger the money market mechanisms that see interest rates rise and interest sensitive components of aggregate demand stifled. The impact of fiscal policy in the ISLM model can be seen from the value of the fiscal policy multiplier in this model. The fiscal policy multiplier under ISLM model shows the change in equilibrium level of income as a result of the change in government spending, holding the real money supply constant. When there is an increase in autonomous spending as a result of an increase in government spending, so that change in A is equals to change in G, the effect of this change in G is given by change in Y naught divided by change in G is equals to lambda, where lambda is equals to H alpha G divided by H plus K into B into alpha G. The expression gamma is the fiscal or government spending multiplier when the interest rate adjustment is taken into account. It can be clearly seen that gamma is different from alpha G, which is the government spending multiplier. The expression gamma is less than alpha G because it is multiplied by a fraction H divided by H plus K into B into alpha G. This represents the dampening effect of increased interest rate associated with the fiscal expansion in the ISLM model. When expansionary fiscal policy is adopted, it results in excess demand for money and causes an increase in interest rate. This increase in interest rate discourages investment because in the IS curve, investment is a function of interest rate. So, the income does not increase by that much because of the crowding out of the private investment due to higher interest rate. A higher interest rate sensitivity reflected in terms of higher value of B reduces the multiplier effect due to large reduction in the aggregate spending. Hence, the severity of crowding out is largely determined by the magnitude of the crowding out effect. Greater the magnitude of this effective, the more ineffective fiscal policy would be in influencing the output. So, the crowding out effects of fiscal policy must be minimized in order to maximize its effectiveness. Next, we will discuss the factors which determine the effectiveness of fiscal policy in ISLM model. The fiscal policy of the government aims at altering the level of economic activity in the economy. When expansionary fiscal policy is adopted, it is assumed to raise the level of income and output in the economy. The expansionary effect of fiscal policy is crowded out by the rise in interest rate in the ISLM framework. It means that output rises by lesser amount than the targeted. There are many factors which determine the effectiveness of fiscal policy in the ISLM model. Moving on to the extent of crowding out. The effectiveness of fiscal policy depends upon the magnitude of crowding out effect. A fiscal expansion is completely effective if there is no crowding out or interest rate changes do not affect the investment level. On the other hand, higher the crowding out, lesser will be the effectiveness of fiscal expansion. The magnitude of crowding out in turn depends upon varying slopes of IS and LM curves. A. The flatter the IS curve, lesser change in income and interest rate will occur. B. The steeper is the LM curve, the less expansionary will be the fiscal policy and the larger is the crowding out effect. C. The flatter LM curve implies that demand for money is highly sensitive to the changes in interest rate. In this case, a small increase in interest rate is enough to maintain the money market equilibrium. So, the fiscal policy is quite effective with lesser crowding out of investment. D. A flatter IS implies that investment spending is highly sensitive to the changes in interest rate. Thus, even a smaller interest rate increase crowds out a significant level of investment, thereby dampening most of the expansionary effect of fiscal policy on income. This, along with the flatter LM, that is high sensitivity of demand for money to change in interest rate, implies that crowding out is lesser as interest rate rise is small. Now, let us discuss tool of fiscal expansion. The expansionary fiscal policy tools of government spending and taxes raise the income or output level, but at the same time interest rate also rises, which reduces the investment spending and dampens the overall expansionary effect of the fiscal policy. However, fiscal policy in the form of granting investment subsidy increases the interest rate, consumption, income as well as investment. In order to offset the reduction in investment, when interest rate rises, the government can provide investment subsidy. This fiscal policy tool raises the investment spending at each level of interest rate. Investment subsidy is sometimes given in the form of tax credits in order to encourage investment. When government subsidizes investment, it pays a part of the investment cost to the firms. This means that investment curve shifts rightward at each level of interest rate. In such a case, although interest rates will rise, but the investment will still be higher on the new investment curve. So, the interest rate increase dampens but does not reverse the impact of the investment subsidy. Next, we will discuss the case of economy in liquidity trap or classical case. An economy is said to be in liquidity trap when the public is prepared to hold whatever amount of money at a given interest rate. It means that LM curve is horizontal and changes in the monetary policy do not shift it and has no effect on the interest rate and income. Under liquidity trap, the interest rate in the economy is so low, almost zero, that with the increase in real balances, people cannot be induced to buy bonds which pay zero interest rate. In liquidity trap, LM curve is horizontal and rise in government spending shifts the IS curve rightward and has its full effect on the equilibrium level of income. There is no dampening of the effects of increased government spending on income. This is shown in given figure. The rightward shift of IS curve raises the income by full multiplier amount and interest rate remains at the original level R. The other extreme shape of LM curve is vertical. A vertical LM curve implies that the demand for money is completely unresponsive to the changes in interest rate. The vertical LM is called as the classical case because the level of nominal income is solely determined by the quantity of money. When LM curve is vertical, monetary policy can affect the level of income in the economy, but the fiscal policy leads to the changes in interest rate only without affecting the level of income. The vertical LM curve implies that if the demand for money is not related to the interest rate, then there is a unique level of income at which money market is in equilibrium. It means that when government spending rises, it changes only interest rate and does not change the equilibrium level of income. increased government spending is offset by the reduction in private spending. In this case, rise in the interest rates crowds out an amount of private investment equals to the rise in the government spending. Thus, there is full crowding out if LM curve is vertical.
This is shown in given figure. As a result of rightward shift of IS curve from IS to IS1, interest rate rises and displaces the expansionary effect of government spending by the fall in private spending 1-for-1. This is the case of complete or full crowding out, which implies that fiscal policy is totally ineffective.
Now, we will understand effectiveness of fiscal policy in the ADAS framework. The aggregate demand curve shows all the combinations of prices and output at which goods and assets markets are simultaneously in equilibrium. Aggregate demand, that is AD curve, is derived from the ISLM curves. Any change in price shifts the money market equilibrium, that is LM curve. This in turn leads to the establishment of a new point of simultaneous equilibrium in goods and assets market, which corresponds to the movement along the AD curve. The AD schedule thus shows the equilibrium level of spending or output at each level of prices given the nominal stock of money and fiscal policy. AD curve is downward sloping as more is demanded only at a lower price. Any change in either money stock or the fiscal policy parameters shift the AD curve. Aggregate supply curve reflects the supply side conditions, that is, the conditions in the factor as well as goods market. Aggregate supply, that is AS curve, shows the quantity of output that the firms are willing to supply for each given price level. It is upward sloping as firms wish to supply more when prices are higher unless the full employment conditions prevails. The intersection of AD and AS curve determines the equilibrium price and output at which the economy is in equilibrium. The shift in any of these curves changes the equilibrium point in the economy. It is also important to understand that how the alternate supply conditions affect the impact of fiscal policy, which shifts the AD curve. Moving on to the Keynesian supply condition. The Keynesian aggregate supply curve is horizontal. This implies that firms will supply any amount of output that is demanded at the given price level. This is based on the assumption that an economy may be operating below its full employment. As there is unemployment, firms can easily hire additional labor without much change in the prevailing wage rate.
In figure, with the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, which is horizontal, the downward sloping AD curve determines equilibrium at point E0 with price level given at P and output at Y0. As a result of a fiscal expansion, AD curve shifts rightward from AD1 to AD2. The new equilibrium is established at E1 where at output has increased to Y1 at the given price level. This is because the firms are willing to supply any amount of output at the prevailing price, that is perfectly elastic supply. A fiscal expansion increases only income and employment. The results are similar to what we get when the LM curve is horizontal in the Keynesian liquidity trap.
Next, we will discuss the classical supply condition. The basic classical assumption is that the economy always operates at the full employment level and any deviation in demand will lead to the changes in wages and prices and economy will again return to the full employment. Based on this, The classical aggregate supply curve is vertical, indicating that the same full employment level of output is supplied whatever the price level be. The supply of output is perfectly inelastic at the full employment level of output, that is at Y star.
This is shown in given figure. As a result of expansionary fiscal policy, AD curve shifts to the right from AD to AD1. At the initial price P0, the demand exceeds what the firms are willing to supply. This causes an upward movement of prices until AD and AS again equate at point E1. As prices rise, the real income with people falls. This implies that the fiscal expansion leads to higher prices, lower real balances, and higher interest rate, and hence reduced private spending. It implies that at point E1, increased government spending crowds out an equal amount of spending, thereby leading to higher prices, but with no increase in the equilibrium output and income. There is thus full crowding out. Thus, in the classical case of perfectly inelastic supply, an expansionary fiscal policy leads to full crowding out. Next, we will discuss modern supply condition. The modern supply condition is a case which is in between these extreme cases of aggregate supply. Here the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. A fiscal expansion shifts the AD curve right from AD to AD1. As a result, prices and output both increase from P0 to P1. The increase in price and interest rate crowds out some spending from Y2 to Y1. But overall, a fiscal expansion leads to a rise in income and output from Y0 to Y1. Due to crowding out of spending and the increase in prices, income rises from Y0 to only Y1. This is shown in given figure. Thus, our analysis shows that the effect of fiscal policy also depends on the elasticity of aggregate supply curve. Now, let us understand classical, Keynesian, and modern phase of effectiveness of fiscal policy in different phases. In given diagram, income and output is represented on x-axis and price level is represented on y-axis. AD and AS are the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve respectively. Due to the increase in government expenditure, AD1 shifts rightward to AD2 and income increases from Y1 to Y2. Here AS is the horizontal straight line curve. This increase in income is considered to be a full expansionary income as price remains same. Y1, Y3 is the Keynesian phase of fiscal expansion. Similarly, Y3, Y star F is the modern phase of fiscal expansion in which AS is upward sloping curve. Here, income increases only from Y4 to Y5 due to the increase in government expenditure, and it is not full expansionary income because of the crowding out effect. In classical phase, AS is vertical straight line curve. In this, AD5 shifts rightward to AD6 due to the increase in government spending, but there is no increase in income and output, and all effect is on price level and there is full employment.
Finally, we will discuss the situations where crowding out is a rare possibility. The conception of crowding out is important as it has implications for the policy ineffectiveness in influencing the output in the economy. There are many assumptions on which the ISLM model is built. Any change in this will make the probability of crowding out weaker. Some of the situations are discussed under which the crowding out effect is unlikely. First, during recession and liquidity trap, Keynesians argued that in a recession and liquidity trap, there is no crowding out because the government is merely spending unused resources. Under liquidity trap, the LM curve is elastic and increased government spending does not increase the interest rate and raises output by its full multiplier effect. Another dimension of thinking about a recession is that the rise in the government borrowing is merely to offset the rise in the private sector saving. Thus, there should not be any crowding out. Second, assumption of underemployment in the economy. In the Keynesian analysis, prices are assumed to be constant and economy is assumed to be operating below the full employment level. It is assumed that when fiscal expansion raises the demand, firms can raise the level of output by hiring more workers, but in reality, full employment prevails in the economy and firms cannot raise output. The increase in demand leads to a rise in the price level rather than output. Third, vertical LM curve is a rare possibility. Now, if we assume an economy with unemployed resources, there will not be full crowding out because LM curve is not vertical. Any rise in the aggregate spending raises the income, and with the rise in income, the level of savings also rises. This expansion in savings in turn makes it possible to finance a larger budget deficit without completely displacing the private spending. Capital S is equals to I plus G plus TR minus TA. Fourth, monetary accommodation to the fiscal expansion. With unemployment and a possibility for output to expand, interest rate need not rise at all when fiscal expansion is undertaken. When government spending rises, monetary authorities can accommodate the fiscal expansion by a rise in money supply to prevent the interest rate from rising. This will further prevent any crowding out effect. This monetary accommodation is referred to as monetizing budget deficits. Now, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. First, the ISLM, that is investment saving and liquidity preference money supply model, is a macroeconomic model that graphically represents two markets, that is goods and money market, which are simultaneously in equilibrium. Second, in the ISLM framework, the rise in national income is less than the change in the government spending because excess demand for money in the money market raises the interest rate, which crowds out the private investment. Third, there are many factors which influence the effectiveness of fiscal policy, like the extent of crowding out, which in turn depends on the slope of IS and LM curves, fiscal policy tool used, etc. Fourth, the steeper is the LM curve, the less expansionary will the fiscal policy be, and the larger is going to be the crowding out effect. Fifth, there is complete crowding out when the LM curve is vertical, that is in the case of classicals, and zero crowding out when the LM curve is horizontal, that is in the Keynesian case. Sixth, the elasticity of aggregate supply curve is also a major determinant of the impact of aggregate demand policies. Seventh, the crowding out is unlikely when economy is in liquidity trap, recession, and at full employment level of output.